morning. Welcome to a live Kerfefe break on Deprogrammed with Keri Smith. It's a different time. We're starting an hour early, so there might just be a few folks here since it's not our usual time. But I see some familiar faces in the chat already. Therese, hello. Happy Monday, Wrong Thinkers. Happy Monday to you. My husband's here from the road. Anthony Garcia Music. We're actually I'm very excited to see you today, my husband. we are we're starting early today because my aunt is visiting and she's never been to the Alamo, and before she leaves, we have to hightail it to San Antonio, meet up with my husband, visit the Alamo and the Alamo's basement to see if they have Pee-wee's bike. He's still looking for it. That's where we're going. And so, apologies for the change of time, but appreciate those of you who could show up. So, if you are new here, oh, hey, Omni, there is someone new here. Morning, Carrie. I'm new. Well, welcome. So, if you're new here, this is a live show we do on Mondays and Fridays, and we usually do it at noon Central Time. We just hang out, talk about what's in the news or what's on our mind. And if you have questions in the chat or suggestions, feel free to throw them out there. I think we have a pretty diverse chat in terms of opinions. And so sometimes we talk about religion, and we have Christians and atheists and sometimes Muslims, Hindus in the chat. So there'll be disagreement, which is great. And I just love the way that people can disagree in this chat and not be jerks about it. So welcome. Did not do a live show on Friday because I made an announcement. We had our third house concert, and we did 2 in one day. My husband invited a lot of his friends, fellow musicians, and it was all Latin music and some classical pieces, some opera. It was amazing. It was so fun. I got to see some of you in person, and yeah, I love these. They're getting better each time. If you want to get on the mailing list for our next house concert, email me at deprogrammedpod@gmail.com. Now, we are located near Georgetown, Texas. So if you are in the area or if you want to make a trip and visit, you're welcome to come. Send me an email. We don't post the ticket links publicly because it's our house. So as long as I know you or you tell me who you are in the email, we'll get you the ticket link. And yeah, it was just, I'm blown away by my husband. I know I'm biased. He's my husband, but I'm blown away by his talent and by the caliber of musicians he brought. There was someone there from the audience, actually, from the Deprogrammed audience, who said to me, he was laughing and he said, "Well, I guess you have to play 3 instruments minimum to be in this band," because they were all switching. Like, and now this guy's on trumpet, and now he's on piano, and now he's on drums, and they're just multi-talented. It was amazing. So that was fun. Okay. That's it. I don't have a lot of announcements. We are just going to jump into the topic today. And the thing I wanted to talk about today was I saw some people online celebrating that that there's a declining belief in God, and they shared a couple of articles, and they were saying things like, let's get there faster, and this isn't fast enough, kind of thing. And so here is one of the studies they showed, one of the graphs they showed. This is from the Pew Research Center. And I'll try to make this a little bigger. I think that's as big as it's going to get, but I'll tell you what it says. So this is from the Pew Research Center, and it says Protestants and Catholics shrinking as share of U.S. population, and all subsets of nuns are growing. And so if you look at this graph here, it's on the bottom, you can see it's from the years 2007 to 2018 or 19. So it's just a period of like 10 years. And if you look at where it starts off on the left, you can see that in 2007, there were roughly 51% of people were Protestant, and 24% of people were Catholic. 12% of people said nothing in particular. And then 2% of people said atheist. 2% of people said agnostic. I don't know why they did not combine agnostic with nothing in particular, but maybe they view those as distinct, because I guess agnostic is a belief in something. It just doesn't, you don't know what, and it doesn't matter to you to find out. So nothing in particular. I did see some people asking, why do they have that separated from atheists? I have a guess. I wonder what you guys think. I think they separate that out because atheists themselves, some atheists, sort of treat atheism as if it is a belief system. I mean, they're very convinced. They're they know there is no God. They know it. They believe it. Some of them are even evangelical in the way they preach about their atheism. And that's not all atheists. That's certainly not the atheists I know here at Deprogrammed. But I think it's because, on the whole, people might view atheism itself as some kind of belief system, a belief system about non-belief. So they separate it out for whatever reason. Maybe it's not that reason, but they separated out nothing in particular. So that was 12% in 2007. Now, if you fast forward 10 years to the end of the graph, you can see the trend. The number of Protestants and Catholics are declining. It's dropped off to 43% from 51 Protestant, 20% compared to 24% Catholic. And the number of people who identify as atheist or agnostic is also growing. They both went from 2% to 5% and 4%. And you can see the number of people who say they believe in nothing in particular has increased in those 10 years from 12% to 17%. So the trend is growing. And I thought this was kind of fascinating because I looked at another chart that was tracking a belief in God. And the belief in God has also declined, but not to this degree. And so it was basically still 80 something percent of people who believe in God, although it has dropped off a little bit as well. And so obviously there's a distinction between believing in God and viewing yourself as religious. This is a graph about religion. You know, what denomination are you? It's I think religion and a belief in God don't necessarily describe the same thing. So in any case, I saw people celebrating this, and then I saw one of the articles they shared. We're going to pull this one up. This was from NPR, and this was shared in a celebratory manner. You know, the headline here is America's Christian majority is on track to end. And this is from 2022. This is from last year, NPR. America's Christian majority is on track to end. And there were some really interesting quotes in this article. So they start off with someone who left the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Eliza Campbell. And it says, you know, she spent her entire life as a practicing member. She was born in Utah, where the majority of residents belong to the church. She attended Brigham Young University, a private institution owned and operated by the church. And she says it's part of your whole professional network, your whole emotional community. It touches every facet of your life. 2 years ago, after nearly 3 decades, she left the church. She is one of a growing number of Americans who were raised Christian, but are disaffiliating from the religion. And then they have a section here that says America's Christian majority is facing steep declines. Christianity remains the majority religion in the United States, as it has been since the country's founding, but it's on the decline. A new study from the Pew Research Center shows America's Christian majority has been shrinking for years. And if recent trends continue, Christians could make up less than half of the U.S. population within a few decades. The study found that Christians accounted for about 90% of the population 50 years ago, but as of 2022, that figure had slumped to about 64%. That is a very steep decline in 50 years. And then it says, if recent trends in switching or changing one's religious affiliation hold, we projected that Christians could make up between 35% and 46% of the U.S. population in 2070, said Stephanie Kramer, the senior researcher who led the study. The study modeled 4 scenarios for how religious affiliation could change, and in every case, it found a sharp drop in Christianity. And so then here they have a graph of what they're projecting. And they say, if this trend continues, U.S. Christians are projected to fall below 50% of the population if recent trends continue. And you can see they have a little chart here from 1972 to 2020. And then beyond the 2020, that's their projection if the trend continues. And you can see it just continues the decline. And they have 4 different outcomes. While the study does not grapple with the question of why Christians are disaffiliating from the religion, Kramer said there are some theories that could help explain the phenomenon. So this is one of the interesting quotes. Look at this one. Some scholars say that it's just an inevitable consequence of development for societies to secularize. Once there are strong secular institutions, once people's basic needs are met, there's less need for religion, Kramer said. So this stood out to me, this quote, because I was thinking about what this guy's saying here, and a couple of things came to mind immediately. One, we've talked about this on Deprogrammed before. I think there are a lot of people who are substituting a faith in a higher being or power or creator or God. They're substituting that with a belief in a worship of the government, a worship of the government providing for everything, and not just providing for all of your needs, but also your emotional needs. There's a lot more of this language from politicians in the past few years. I'm thinking of people like AOC who say stuff about, the government loving you, the government, it's kind of painting this picture of this benevolent father who has our best intentions at heart. And that's pretty alarming to me because I don't think that the government actually cares very very much about our well-being. Maybe call me a cynic. I guess I'm a new cynic in that way. But I think it's very alarming to put all of your whatever that part of a human is, that part of us that wants to worship, some of us who wants to worship, who wants to have faith, who wants to have a feeling of security and a belief that innate need. I happen to believe we were created by a creator for that need, that we have a longing for that relationship. And so I think it's weird to transfer it to the government and look to the government to fulfill those needs. But the other thing I was thinking about this quote, it says, once people's basic needs are met, there's less need for religion. In one way, I think this person is right about something, which is that, yes, in secular society, we do provide for people's needs, even the creature comforts. As I've said before on the show, my pastor likes to say, or I heard him say once in a sermon, that in the history of humankind and all the places and times that people have lived, we live like royalty lived in most other times and places. We live with so much privilege, to use a social justice word. We have running water, we have electricity, we have AC. We had friends over this weekend. We were talking about, countries in which that's not the norm. In some countries where, you can just turn on the air conditioner in a hot climate. We have so many creature comforts. We have exotic fruits. We have anything. We can go to the grocery store and pretty much get anything, even if it doesn't grow here. It's like, I want a kiwi. Great. Go to the HEB if you're in Texas, So in some ways, yes, a lot of our basic needs and more are being met. And I do believe that when that happens, when we as humans stop focusing on survival, maybe because we don't have to focus on survival, we suddenly have a lot more I guess privilege to focus on other unimportant things, and we also have maybe this tendency to think that we don't need a faith in a creator, or we don't need God because we're so evolved, we're so advanced, we're so intelligent, right? That certainly in this culture, whether you're atheist or a believer of some kind, I think you'd have to agree that there is this attitude of looking at believers as being less intelligent or intellectually inferior. So I think they get it right in one way in this quote about, maybe the need for religion is dropping off because a lot of our basic needs are being met. But here's the final thought on this quote. Are we doing great? Like, what about our other needs? What about our needs beyond iPhones and, alcohol and video games and oranges that we can get and kiwis that we can get at the store and running water and electricity and all of it? What about our spiritual needs or emotional needs, our psychological needs, the needs for our families? Are those being met? What's been happening? This graph we looked at is tracking how the belief in God and religion has been declining since the 50s. And the people who were sharing this, as I said, were celebrating that, like, oh, we're doing so great. We're so smart. We're so evolved now. And I don't think that's true. If you look at the statistics of people who have depression, anxiety, if you look at statistics of broken homes, of single parent homes, obesity rates, the number of people taking pharmaceuticals, antidepressants, um, suicide rates, if you start to look at all of these different measurements of our societal mental health, emotional health, like psychological health, and even physical health, it's been falling. It's on the decline. In every measurement on the decline, that we're not doing that great. Now, I'm not saying these things are correlated. I'm not saying they're related. I can't prove that. But I have obviously a hunch that they could be related. So let me scroll down because I want to show you guys one other quote in this article that was pretty similar and also interesting. So I'll read this one again. I'll continue. Some scholars say that it's just an inevitable consequence of development for societies to secularize. Once there are strong secular institutions, once people's basic needs are met, there's less need for religion, Kramer said. Other people point out that affiliation really started to drop in the 90s, and it may not be a coincidence that this coincides with the rise of religious right and more associations between Christianity and conservative political ideology. This is could be, I mean, I guess you could apply this to me. I definitely was turned off by people like Jerry Falwell and a lot of the mega preachers and the mega conservative preachers in the 90s, and I took those people to be representative of all Christians. And so maybe that's true. Maybe a lot of people look at those guys and are like, oh, that's what Christians are. Okay. For Campbell, conflict between the teachings of her faith and her own personal identity and values were at the core of her decision to leave. And then she says, for me, especially when I started to come out as queer, it became impossible for me to reconcile this church that was basically admitting that they wanted kids like me dead or suicidal. Okay, I was with you until this part, that they wanted kids like you dead or suicidal. Come on. This is histrionics. This is hyperbole, and it's a lie. So they just said something about her values. Well, one of your values is clearly not to tell the truth, because you can talk about and you can criticize the church's stance on homosexuality without putting a lie out there like they want me dead. Like that's just lose all respect at that point. How can I have a conversation with a person like this woman? It's impossible. So anyway, she says, I decided I had to choose myself and choose my well-being. But let me scroll down to this other quote. So they also profile a guy who left his Muslim faith, Hassan Tahua. He says, and this is what he says, quote, it's almost what I expect, Hassan Tahua, a student of Stanford University, said of the rising numbers of religiously unaffiliated people in the United States. Quote, I don't think it's surprising. I think it's a product of modern comforts. I think when life is good, when it's better, religion is just not as important. And then it says, he was not raised Christian. He spent most of his life as a devout Muslim, but decided 4 years ago to leave his religion, and he now identifies as atheist. So this quote of his, very similar to the other one. He says, I don't think it's surprising. I think it's a product of modern comforts. I think when life is good, when it's better, religion is just not as important. And again, this made me think of that final point I had on the other quote. Is it better? Is life better for people? We should look at some of the metrics and just see how has the population changed in, since the 50s? Overlapping. I just wanna look at this period of time in which they're saying the belief in God is declining, religion is declining because we're having it better and better and better, and things are getting greater, and all of our needs are being met. Life is good, right? Is it good? I just wanna see if that's true. So we're gonna pull up some statistics, and I'll take a look in the chat real quick to see. Hey guys, sorry haven't been paying too much attention to it because I was trying to read through that. But if I miss something important, put a big flashing sign in the chat. Okay, let's start with this one. This is a graph of the number of percentage of children who are living in single parent homes. And you can see this is from at the bottom of the graph here from 1970 to 2014. The number of children living in single parent homes has just exploded. In 1970, it was down near, what is that, 12% of children. And 2014, you can see it's around 28%. So there's a trend here of more kids who are being raised in single parent homes. Why does this matter? I know if you're on the left and you're watching, and I hope you are, you're probably immediately, because I was on the left. I don't know what I am anymore, but I was deep in the leftist world for 20 years. And so I still have that little internal social justice warrior who kind of says things to me. I can already hear what you guys are thinking, which is, why does it matter? Why does it matter if a kid is in a single parent home? Are you shaming single moms? Are you trying to shame them? Are you trying to say that they, don't do a good job? No, I'm not trying to shame them at all. Single parents work their butts off by necessity. A lot of them. Some of them don't, as we know, just like some parents in two-parent homes are not good parents. But it's not shaming single parent homes or divorce households to state a truth, which is that all evidence shows that the number one factor that predicts whether a child is going to be successful mentally, physically, academically, financially, all of those ways, the number one factor is whether or not they were raised in a home with both of their biological parents. Now, hear what I'm saying. It doesn't mean that if you're not raised in that kind of home, you're not going to be successful. And it doesn't mean that if you're raised in that kind of home, you are going to be successful. I think sometimes people, our lack of understanding of bell curves and averages and statistics really hampers hearing a truth like that and prevents people from understanding what it means. What it means is that on average, kids do better if they are raised in a two-parent home with both of their biological parents, on average. And the way a bell curve looks is like this, right? And so you've got all these people on this side of the bell curve, and you've got all these people on this side of the bell curve who don't fall into that average. You've got the ones who are doing extremely well, and you've got the ones who were raised in the two-parent homes who are not doing well. There are outliers. That's what a bell curve is. So, that factor, whether or not the kid is raised with both parents, it is more important than what race they are, what their sex is, and get this, it's more important than how much money they have, like what their class is, what if they grew up poor or not. Kids are more likely to be successful in every metric if they're poor and grow up in a two-parent home than if they are wealthy with a single parent. I know it sounds like a hate fact, but it's true. So that's why that's important, because if you care about providing the best possible environment and, petri dish for kids to thrive and to grow up healthy in all these different ways and have the best chance of success, well then yeah, we should care about, well, how many kids are growing up that way and how many kids are growing up in single parent homes. So it's been increasing. That's a trend. We're going to look at another one. Let's look at another metric, another one relating to kids. Oh no, I don't want to see your ad. This is from Athena Health, 2019. So remember, now this is before COVID. I specifically pulled one before COVID because you can find the same alarming statistics after COVID, obviously, but I knew people would sort of be like, well, that could be explained in the past 2 years. No, this is a trend that was developing way before the COVID years. So this article is from 2019. Up and up, pediatric anxiety diagnoses are on the rise. It's a trend that should be familiar to anyone in pediatric medicine. More and more children are being diagnosed with anxiety, and they're increasingly being treated with anti-anxiety medications. Are kids more anxious today, or are doctors more likely to diagnose and treat pediatric anxiety? I think it's probably a little of both. I think kids are more anxious today. They self-report that in study after study. They're more depressed. There's more suicide attempts. They have more anxiety. A lot of the rising rates of all this depression, anxiety in children happen to coincide with these things, phones. But it also overlaps with this period of time we're looking at. Again, I'm not saying it's correlated. I'm just saying it's interesting, given that we're being told one of the reasons people don't need God anymore is because we're all doing so great and society is just covering all of our needs. I would argue that's not true. There are a lot of needs that are not being met. And what's that book? Are the kids all right? Somebody correct me in the chat if I get that wrong. I don't think the kids are all right. I don't think they're doing that great. So here's a chart. The percent of pediatric patients with anxiety diagnoses has grown over the last 5 years. And you can see here from 2013 to 2017 that the number of children who are being diagnosed with anxiety disorders has increased from 1.9% to 4.4% in 2017. And again, this is before the COVID years. It's higher now. I'm going to stop there. The kids are not all right, says So Create Some Good. Yeah. I have so much respect for parents who are trying to raise healthy kids in this current culture and society, because I imagine it's a lot of deprogramming you have to do constantly. Speaking of deprogramming, let's look at adults. How are adults doing in the past few decades? Are all of our needs being met? We don't need God anymore. This is an article from WebMD. U.S. adults report depression at record rates survey. This is from this month, and this is being reported in lots of different outlets currently. Depression rates among U.S. adults have reached the highest levels ever recorded since the national public opinion firm Gallup started tracking the mental illness in 2015. In a survey, 29% of adults said that they had been diagnosed with depression during their lifetime, and 18% said they currently have depression or are being treated for it. Those rates are up from the baseline of 2015 rates of 20% of people ever having depression and 11% of people with a current diagnosis. Depression had been steadily rising before the pandemic. And the Gallup analysis wrote that, quote, social isolation, loneliness, and fear of infection, psychological exhaustion, Elevated substance abuse and disruptions in mental health services have all likely played a role in the increase. So again, though, this important part here had been steadily rising before the pandemic. Remember, this isn't just a post-COVID trend. Along those lines, I'm going to pull up this graph. This was from the New York Times, and we covered this here on Deprogrammed a couple weeks ago. We did an episode called Why Are Women Unhappy? And this is one of the graphs that we looked at in that episode, and it's just so shocking to some people that I thought we should just pull this up again. I think it's very I hope I can. So I can't make this any larger. I'm just going to you can see the trend though here in the graph. I'll tell you what the lines represent. So this is from the New York Times, and it's called The Demographics of Long-Term Antidepressants. And then underneath that, it says older white women account for 58% of adults who have used antidepressants for at least 5 years. And so they've got this chart here from the year 2000 to the year 2015. So a 15-year period. And these are, again, remember the rates of people who are taking antidepressants. And then they have it divided by race and sex. And so down at the bottom, now every metric is increasing in this chart except for younger adults is that one that drops off there at the end in 2015. If you look at current numbers, it's back up again. But here we go. At the bottom, you've got minority men, age 45 plus. Above that, you've got minority women, age 45 plus. Then you've got the younger adults. Then you have this second highest one here, peaking out in 2015 at second highest. That is white men, age 45 plus. And then look at this huge spike, this number one metric here. White women, age 45 plus, more than 8 million white women age 45 plus are on antidepressants for more than 5 years. That's a lot of people. And so trends show that's increasing. I would say I don't know if we are doing so great as a society, meeting everyone's needs. Remember, that's what the quote said. When secular institutions are able to meet everyone's needs and life is good and getting better, don't need religion. Who needs God? Yeah, thanks, Beard. Beard, thank you for the super chat for $5. He says, I'll have to catch on the upload. But who needs God when you have your truth? Who needs to describe God's world when you can ascribe meaning? That's it exactly. I think that's part of it exactly. Is that kind of arrogance, that cultural arrogance I was talking about at the beginning. And we live in the time period we happen to live in currently in the US is the dominant religion, I would argue, is social justice, which has roots in postmodernism, where you define your own truth. What's your truth? Speak your truth. What's a woman? What's a man? What's racism? Everything is being redefined. There's no objective reality. There's no good and evil. And so, yeah, we're living in this interesting time where it's like, who needs God when it's all about you defining reality, you defining truth, you defining your identity? Very narcissistic kind of time period. Thank you for the super chat. Arnawa in the chat says, meaning cannot be found in a pill or the bottom of a bottle. You are absolutely right. Addiction rates are on the increase as well. Speaking of pills and bottles, you guys who have been here for a while know that my husband and I have been sober. I got the number wrong the other day. I guess I'm getting old. I said it was 2.5 years. It's 3.5 years. I've been sober 3.5 years. which I never thought I would be able to say. And, during those decades when I was turning to alcohol as one of my many crutches, I'll tell you what I wasn't finding there. I wasn't finding meaning or purpose. Was I finding pleasure? Yes, absolutely. Was I checking out from acknowledging or dealing with stuff around me? Absolutely. Avoiding things? Was it kind of a form of procrastination? Yes. And sometimes I think it was a slow form of suicide in a way. Addiction can be. But you're not going to find meaning there. You can keep postponing your search for meaning. You can keep denying that you might have a need for meaning by turning to alcohol or pills. But it's still going to eat at you. That's my opinion. You might disagree. Hey, Brentley. Brentley from Dangerous Rhetoric is here. Hello, sir. He says, I just learned that Conor Sturgeon was suffering from anxiety and panic attacks post-COVID, which likely contributed to his mass shooting in Louisville. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, I'm sure. If you look up if you look up stats on mass shooters, there are some things that you tend to see like a pattern. Not always, not with everyone. Again, we're talking about averages, but on average, a lot of them have issues with anxiety or depression or some kind of personality disorder, or they're on antipsychotics in some cases, or pharmaceuticals, or one interesting thing, we were speaking about two-parent households. A lot of them have an absent father, or they have a controlling mother. You can see these patterns that instead of talking about these things and trying to figure out what matters, what might be a common thread, we always end up talking about guns instead, and it overshadows. Guns are not the reason. We never get to talk about the possible reasons. Why is society becoming sick? We never get to talk about that because they have us focused over here constantly. If we just get rid of the guns, we're going to be great. No. Brentley says, yeah, he was medicated per his parents. Okay, let's pull up another one. We're just looking at different metrics to see how are we doing? How are we doing? Society's meeting all of our needs, these two quotes said. Life is good and getting better, these two quotes said. So it makes sense, these quotes said, that we don't have a need for God or religion because we're doing great, and secular society its secular institutions are meeting all of our needs. Okay, how are we doing? Let's look at another metric. Obesity. This is one we're not supposed to talk about anymore because it offends the woke and the social justice world. They've now social justice, if you're new here, woke, if you're new here, the best way to describe it, I was in it for 20 years. The best way I've found to describe it to people is that it's a belief system that tells you the best way to look at the world is as a competition for power between identity groups. That is all of human history has been a competition for power between identity groups. And in every identity group, there's an oppressor and there are the oppressed, or they also use the words, privileged groups and marginalized groups. And they say all of human history is about these groups, what identity groups you're in, who's privileged and the oppressor, and who's the oppressed, and that's the best way to view human history. It's not the best way. We'll go into that's a subject for another video, but it's a terrible ideology. But in part of that belief system and all of these rapidly evolving identity groups, in a belief system like that, you're going to have more and more oppressed identities that are getting pulled, so-called oppressed identities that are getting pulled into this ideology. And so one of those is obesity. One of those is size. And so you've probably heard social justice terms being used for these groups now. They say that average weight people or thin people are the oppressors and that fat people or obese people are the oppressed, that they're discriminated against, that they are marginalized, and they're not privileged like healthy people, healthy weight people. And they use language, social justice language, like person of size, that you should call people a person of size instead. And I used to, I'll tell you, guilty admission, those of you who know me now is who I am now. My old life, when I was woke, I used person of size. I used the PC language. So this is one area of healthiness, of measuring how healthy are we as a nation, as a society, as a culture, that we're not supposed to talk about. They don't want us to look at the rising obesity rates because they say it's fat shaming. Again, it's not shaming to look at truths. You're not calling people bad people for being overweight. You're not calling people morally inferior for being overweight. Everyone has a thorn of some kind. I just told you one of mine was alcohol. It's not shaming to talk about the fact that obesity rates are rising and that is unhealthy for us as a culture. That's unhealthy for children. Holocron says, Keri, good thing you're not a person of wokeness anymore. Yes. Person of wokeness. Okay, so here we go. This is an article from usafacts.org. U.S. obesity rates have tripled over the last 60 years. Again, the reason I'm trying to find data, we're trying to look at data over this same period of time that they're saying, we're doing so great, secular society's providing all of our needs, it's awesome, life is good, that's why we don't need God, and the belief in God's declining. I'm just trying to look and see if that's true, that we're doing great. This is another metric, obesity. Well, obesity rates have tripled over the last 60 years. Nationwide surveys showed that 43% of Americans are obese. It's nearly half. And obese is not overweight. It's a different category. This is not simply overweight, it's obese. Right? Nationwide surveys show that 43% of Americans are obese, while 10% are morbidly obese. If you look at people who are overweight, it goes up above 50%. If you include the people who are merely overweight, nearly 70% of adults in the US, 70% are either overweight or obese. According to nationwide surveys the National Institutes of Health has conducted since the early 1960s, U.S. obesity rates have tripled over the last 60 years. Severe obesity, also known as morbid obesity, they don't like that term either, by the way. As you can guess, the woke don't use the term, it's offensive. Also known as morbid obesity, has risen tenfold. State data suggests that just over a third of Americans are currently obese. However, nationwide data shows that this could be an underestimation. Let's look at how that's changed over time. In the early 1960s, roughly 13% of people were considered obese by Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Guidelines, the CDC. Recent figures suggest that a current national obesity rate is closer to 43%. That's a huge jump in just 60 years. In addition, nearly 10% of all Americans were morbidly obese during the 2017-2018 survey, compared to less than 1% in 1960 to 1962. Here, we're getting to the children again. How is this affecting kids? How are kids doing? Are the kids all right? Childhood obesity rates have tripled from 5% in the early 1970s to more than 19% by March of 2020. Nationwide obesity rates. Look, here we go. You can see it in graph form. It's easier to see it than read it sometimes. At the top here on the left, we have the years 1960 to 1962. That's that first bar graph. And the blue lines are severe obesity or morbid obesity. The pink lines are obesity. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the graph, you can see just how far these lines keep going. This bottom one here is the years 2017 to 2018. Why is this important? How is this related? Well, I think it's a sign of how healthy we are as a culture, as a society. We're not placing an emphasis on physical health or mental health. The new religion, the dominant religion, woke, actually provides a lot of roadblocks to people getting healthier, both mentally and physically. Because one of the things it does is it tells you that your identity, that these identity groups, that it's important. It's the way in which the lens in which we need to look at the world. And in this ideology, it's better to be in all these different marginalized and, oppressed groups because you have more social currency. You get to tell other people to check their privilege and, listen to you. Your voice matters more in social justice. If you have a mental health issue, if you're overweight, if you're fat, if you're a person of size, you're in an oppressed group. And so that doesn't give you an incentive to get out of that group. I've said this a lot, so some of you heard me say it, but if you go, a lot of woke people, a lot of social justice people who are in my old cult, in their bios on Twitter and stuff, they just list like their identities, all the oppressed groups they're in, so they're like, I'm trans and I'm a trans woman and I'm polyamorous and I am fat and I'm black and I have borderline personality disorder and I have depression. They list all of these things as if these are badges. So why would you give up one of those badges? What's the incentive? People who are in that religion, the woke religion, it makes you unhealthy and it gives you reason to stay in any kind of bad habit you're already in. It gives you a reason to stay there and not do anything about it. We're not even allowed to talk about obesity anymore. They're teaching doctors in med school now, not only that biological sex isn't real, but that it's not unhealthy to be fat, you know? They're actually pushing the idea that doctors should not ask people about their weight. When you go in for a regular checkup, that a doctor should not even talk about your weight as if it's unhealthy. Can you believe that? Can you imagine any other unhealthy metric, the doctor being told, you know what, that patient is a smoker, but don't tell them about the possible health problems that they're going to have or are having, or don't relate it back to smoking because, that's offensive and there's nothing unhealthy about it and you don't want to smoke shame them. You can't imagine that happening. Yeah. Mark says, as a young person, the presidential physical fitness test 1950 to 2013 was emphasized in gym class and commercials. With the move to more tech in schools, kids have less gym classes per year. Yeah. There's just an overall, less attention being paid to this issue. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that woke is the current dominant religion. And so you're not allowed to look at it. It's offensive. Let's look at some more metrics of how are we doing? How are we doing? How are the kids doing? Let's see. This one. Okay. This one is from the CDC. Suicide rates. This is a graph here from the years 2000, down on the bottom on the left, all the way to 2020, so a period of 20 years. Suicide rates increased 37% between the years 2000 and 2018 decreased 5%. It had a slight drop in the year 2018, and then rates nearly returned to their peak in 2021. It's a trend. If you look at graphs, you look at what the trend is, you're going to have little dips here and there, but overall, this trend is growing. The suicide rate is increasing in the United States and has been for at least 20 years, going back far beyond the pandemic, far before the COVID years. Something else that doesn't get talked about a lot is the suicide rate, especially in the conversation about guns. They don't want to talk about. I did a whole episode on this about, it was called What is an Assault Rifle? I've also interviewed Jake Wiskershin from Walk the Talk America, which is a gun rights group and mental health advocacy group. And it wasn't until I talked to him that I knew, I didn't even know that the majority of gun deaths per year are suicides. They're not murders. You wouldn't know that from, what the media presents to us, what the national conversation is. It's almost like we don't want to look at how well we're not doing. Hey, two sisters in some yarn. Welcome. Oh, I saw a couple people saying they're late. Don't worry, you're not actually late. I'm doing the show. We're hanging out an hour earlier today because after this, my husband and I are taking my aunt who's visiting to the Alamo. She's never been to the Alamo. So while she's in Texas, we have to do that. And I appreciate you guys hanging out with me a bit early. So let's continue. For those of you who joined late, we were looking at statistics at the beginning. We looked at some statistics about the declining belief in God and declining religion in the United States since the 1950s. And some of the quotes, an academic was quoted, and then one of the people profiled in the article who had left his Muslim faith was quoted. And they said something essentially like, it makes sense that there's a declining belief in God because as society and social institutions, government institutions like step up and provide for people's needs, and then life is good and life is getting better and we don't need a belief in God. That was the quote. And so it just made me think, like, are we doing great? Is society doing great? Yes, all of our creature comforts, a lot of them are met. All of our basic needs, running water, electricity, food, all of that. And a lot of our wants and desires and pleasures, a lot of our creature comforts are met. But how are we doing mentally, physically, spiritually? How are kids doing? And it's amazing because all of the charts look just like the belief in God chart, dropping off since the 50s. Declining mental health, declining physical health, rising rates of addiction, rising numbers of single parent homes. Okay. I'm going to pull up one more. As I mentioned, out of all the metrics we're looking at, this one is the most recent one. And so it's in a lot of news articles now, this new Gallup poll. So people are talking about it. I want to read through how the mainstream news is discussing it, this new Gallup poll. So this is from ABC News. Depression rates among U.S. adults reach new high, Gallup. Nearly 30% of adults say that they've been diagnosed with depression at some point. Depression rates in the United States are skyrocketing, particularly among young adults and women, a new poll shows. The survey published by Gallup on Wednesday, and this article, by the way, guys, is from May 17th this year. Okay. The survey published by Gallup on Wednesday found that 29% of U.S. adults report being diagnosed with depression at some point during their lifetimes, an increase from 19.6% in 2015. Meanwhile, 17.8% of those aged 18 and older either currently have or are currently being treated for depression, up from 10.5% in 2015. That's a huge jump. And before you say this is just COVID related, it's not. We looked at charts at the beginning. This has been on the increase since well before the pandemic. According to Gallup, both rates are the highest ever recorded by the analytics company since it began tracking depression rates. Quote, I think the results are startling, Dan Witters, research director of the Gallup National Health and Wellbeing, told ABC News. The disproportionate manner in which some groups have been affected by this makes sense to me based upon what we know about other research and those sharp increases in those depression rates among those adults under 30, women too, Blacks and Hispanics. They are really eye-popping. So even here, they're looking at this data through the social justice lens, I believe, because look at how he's dividing it into groups like that. Not that it's not interesting. We should be looking at different metrics for race and sex and how they're affected. But he's not talking about the rates of depression in men, which is also increasing, you know. Although the COVID-19 pandemic can't be blamed completely for the increasing rates, it definitely was a major factor, Witters said. Quote, both of these rates had kind of been coming up over the years pre-pandemic, he said, and you don't want to get too far out in front of your skis as far as putting all the blame on the pandemic. Yeah, you don't. But then he went on, there's plenty of other big factors out there that could be relevant to these increasing rates. Oh, no, this is good, what he's saying. It's true. There's plenty of other big factors out there that could be relevant to these increasing rates that we've been measuring, but the pandemic's a big one. There he goes. And indeed, the rates have really come up significantly in the years since COVID hit. My suspicion was that they're going to try to put it all on COVID instead of talking about, you know, hey, this has been increasing for decades, our mental unwellness. Lifetime and current depression rates. And you can see here on this graph, the blue lines are the percentage of people who've experienced depression during their whole lifetime. And in purple, that is the percentage of people with who currently have depression. And the chart along the bottom is from 2015 to 2023. More than 5,100 adults were surveyed in all 50 states and the District of Columbia during the last week of February 2023. The results are part of the larger ongoing Gallup National Health and Wellbeing Index, which seeks to track and understand factors that drive well-being. Results showed that rates are rising fastest among certain groups, particularly young adults and women. Women's rates of depression during their lifetime climbed from 26.2% in 2017 to 36.7% in 2023. Rates of those with current depression increased from 17.6% to 23.8% over the same period. By comparison, men with depression during their lifetime saw a smaller increase from 17.7% in 2017 to 20.4% in 2023. Current rates for depression rose from 9.3% to 11.3%. Witters said that women have historically had higher rates of depression than men. COVID, however, may have led to a jump in these rates due to women being disproportionately forced to leave the workforce to take care of children at home, and the fact that they make up a higher percentage of frontline healthcare workers. Look at the assumption here. I just think it's an interesting assumption that, you know, everyone was impacted by by authoritarian government policies during COVID. The government doesn't have a right to come in and tell you can't go to work. That if you're in this profession, you're necessary, and in this profession, you're not necessary. That's not the government's right. But as a society, we allowed that to happen. But everybody was impacted negatively by authoritarian policies during the COVID years, men and women. It wasn't just women. But here's the assumption. The assumption is that women may have been disproportionately forced to leave the workforce to take care of children. If that is true, if it was, I don't know if it is, was it mostly women that left the workforce that weren't allowed to go to work? If that's true, why does that lead to increased depression? They just assume that it does. You see how they make these assumptions? It's like, oh gosh, women have to be at home with their kids, so that's probably why they're more depressed. Because what woman wants to be at home with her kids, right? I don't know. I'm just saying maybe their assumption's correct. I just don't I don't buy it, and I don't like it when people put stuff out there that's just a wild opinion or assumption. And when we read articles like this, we tend to just absorb it as if, oh, it's like, oh yeah, and that article, yeah, women became more depressed during COVID because they had to be at home with kids. And that sucks. That's depressing. Davina, depressing, joyful little bundles of joy. Maybe people were more depressed because they were feeling the thumb of government on telling them you cannot go to work. And by the way, you have to wear a mask if you go outside. Like maybe people were depressed because they were experiencing an authoritarian government for maybe the first time, like realizing they were living in one for maybe the first time. Maybe it didn't have to, maybe they're not depressed because they have to be with their kids. Yes, Ethan, that's what they're saying. Women depressed because they get to stay home with kids and it's men's fault. Yeah. Vermont Cheddar, new member here at YouTube. Thank you for the support. I love Vermont Cheddar. I love Manchega. That's my favorite cheese. Okay. Let's continue with this article. Breakdowns by age showed that 1/3 of younger adults between the ages of 18 to 29 reported being diagnosed with depression at some point in their lives, up from 20.4% in 2017. Additionally, 24.6% said they currently have depression, an increase from 13% in 2017. Yeah, the kids are not all right. Witters pointed to other research showing a growing mental health crisis among young people in the U.S. Quote, obviously, social media predates 2017, but social media had the effect on a lot of kids where they feel left out, they feel compelled to look at social media, and they see people out having fun and they're not a part of it, he said. They can get ostracized through social media. Yes, a lot of the rising depression and anxiety rates among kids, among young people, happen to coincide with the proliferation of phones. Adults aged 65 and older had the smallest increase for depression and were the only group that saw a decrease in rates of current depression from 2021. Maybe it's because they've lived more life and they were like, we've seen some of this before. I don't know. When it came to breakdowns by race and ethnicity, results showed rates for Black and Hispanic adults are rising at about twice the rate of white adults. They had to put adults together because if they had separated out white women, that would not have been true. Like if you break it down not just by race, but by race and sex, as we saw in the previous chart, white women are like off the chart. But if they lump white women in with white men, then it's like, then they could say this. When it came to breakdowns by race, ethnicity, results showed rates for Black and Hispanic adults are rising at about twice the rate of white adults. The percentage of Black adults diagnosed with depression at some point in their lifetime rose from 20.1% to 34.4% between 2017 and 2023. For Hispanic adults, the percentage jumped from 18.4% to 31.3% over the same period. I just have a hypothesis since they're putting out their hypothesis here, but they're saying it like it's truth. Their hypothesis is that the depression rates increased for women during COVID because they had to take care of their kids. Well, my hypothesis is, what is it like to live in a society as a Black person or Hispanic person currently when the media, it's constantly telling you that you live in a white supremacist patriarchy and all white people want you dead and want to discriminate against you, and that everyone in this country is racist and hates you for your race, and that you are a victim and you need white people's help. And what was the other stuff they said? Oh, the Smithsonian, when they did their whiteness exhibit, and they said that if you're a person of color, that you don't know how to show up on time. They said this. They said white culture whiteness values things like showing up on time and academic achievement and traditional family unit, 2-parent home. And these are all functions of whiteness. What is that like as a person of color to live in a culture that's constantly programming you to believe this crap about yourself and about your race and about other races. I don't know, maybe it would make you depressed. That's my hypothesis. One possible reason. Comparatively, white adults saw their rates increase from 22.3% in 2017 to 29% in 2023. For a long time, white America and white adults were reporting a clinical diagnosis of depression at rates that exceed Black and Hispanic adults, Witter said. These big increases really show the strain that Black and Hispanic Americans have been under since 2017. Black and Hispanic Americans were more likely to lose their jobs in the early days of the pandemic. Yep, that would be another factor. The government putting their thumb on you. You can't go to work. These other people can. These big chain stores can stay open, but not you. And then he said, events such as the death of George Floyd in May 2020 may have also contributed to depression. Yeah, I would argue it's not so much the death of one individual person. I would argue it's that, that could be contributing to depression. It's not the death of that guy. It's the way in which the media used it to create a narrative that tells Black people they are victims of a white supremacist patriarchy. When the pandemic first hit, across all adults, negative emotional experiences tracked by Gallup, such as sadness and anger, went up a little, but didn't really change that much, Witter said. You fast forward a couple months and you get to kind of the latter part of May and into June, and anger and sadness were up over 10 percentage points. So now he's talking specifically about the COVID years. Well, thank you for letting me read through that article. I was curious how they would cover it, since that was one of the more recent ones, the Gallup poll about the highest rates of depression ever tracked since Gallup started tracking it. I'm going to scroll through. I'm keeping it kind of short today because we have family in town, going to go hang out. But let me read through the chat and see if I missed something. Yeah, Vermont Chatter says, I don't know, maybe it's the lockdowns and riots. Yeah. Maybe it's the lockdowns and riots. It's so funny in the mainstream articles when they talk about the effects of COVID, and they are willing to acknowledge that, yeah, people might have rising, their anxiety levels and their depression might have risen because of fear of infection, and that's true. But they never say, like, or that may have risen because they realized they lived in a country where their government could just illegally come in and say, you can't go to work. Like, that's maybe another reason, maybe the lockdowns. Or they lived in a country where people could be rioting and killing people and setting businesses on fire, and the media would report it as mostly peaceful. Maybe that would contribute also to depression and anxiety. Charlie Stevenson says, television advertising used to show how you were missing out on the good life, and now it's social media. Yeah. Keeping up with the Joneses, a lot of that stuff that happens on the social medias. Okay, you guys, I'm going to wrap up pretty early. If you have any questions or anything you wanted me to hit on before we take off, let me know. Therese, this is perfect. Actually, this is a good ending because we started this talking about the reason I was interested in looking at these metrics with you guys and looking at, how are we doing mentally, emotionally, physically in the past few decades? How are we doing? The reason I was interested in that is because of these articles about how there's a declining belief in God, and maybe one reason that's happening is because we're doing so great and we don't need to believe in God. I mean, that was what was implied by two of the quotes in that NPR article. And I don't think that's the case. I'm not saying it's correlated. I believe it could be. I would believe that, obviously, because I'm a Christian. And so I kind of believe, how I talk about woke as a belief system. It's an ideology. It's a lens through which you filter everything. It's a way to look at the world. And woke is one I used to be in. I think it's a bad one. I think it's an unhealthy one, an evil one, and a racist one. But when you tend to look at the world through that lens, and I look at the world now, I'm finding more frequently through the Christian lens. And so I just I don't know, when I hear about people's different problems, when I look at society's problems, I tend to look at it through my current lens. And I think I'm becoming one of those old ladies who says, "They need Jesus." Like, that's my I know it's funny, but I've just lately started thinking that more and more often, like and so many people are inoculated against a belief in God in our current culture. I was. You're raised with a lot of cultural prejudice against believers and against Jesus and against God, and in our current culture, there's this view that I mentioned where it's like, "Oh, only stupid people believe in God, or only weak people who need, you know, to have faith in something bigger than an imaginary sky god." They say all that kind of stuff, and there's all these psychological barriers, I think, for a lot of people to turn to the one thing. For me anyway, all the things I've struggled with in my life, the one thing that helped me, the one thing that helped me was the last thing I ever thought I would open the door to, open my mind to. I was closed-minded when it came to God. And that turned out to be the thing. That turned out to be the thing that helped, the answer. Yes, that's how that Z Highness, that's how I've become. You need Jesus. But at least I can laugh at it. I don't actually say that to people. I'll say it to myself sometimes, like, "I think that person needs Jesus." Not in a mean way. I just really think it's going to I just really think it's what helps people. Someone told me a week or so ago, I met a new person. I was at an event and we started talking about God. I don't know, like I just randomly these deep conversations happen and because this person was telling me about an addict in their life and they were saying, "Well, he's in his 40s and I just don't think people can't change, and I don't think he's gonna change," and I was like, "Yes, he can." That's the crazy thing. Yes, he can. I changed. I know a lot of people who've changed, but I think he might need Jesus. Sorry, it's funny. I'm becoming that lady. But that's the only thing. In seriousness, not laughing at it. That's the that's the only thing I have seen help a person radically change themselves for better. So, and and yeah, it's unfortunate that we're seeing these declining rates of belief. So Therese says they shut down the churches. Yeah, they did. And that is an excellent point. Not mentioned in any of these mainstream articles. Of course, why would they mention that? Why would they say, they're perfectly willing to say, "Oh, people might be more depressed because of they're afraid of infection, or they might be more depressed because they were told they couldn't go to work." But what about the fact that the churches were closed? Churches are like hospitals for the soul. That's the way I view it. The churches that voluntarily shut their doors, I don't have a lot of respect for them. I don't think they were serving their purpose. Mark, thank you for the super chat. $20, thank you. He says, "We can't truly know ourselves without knowing God and others. Both reflect reality to us. TV and social media reflects a false reality." JP, Jordan Peterson said, "Man can't live without love." Is that how you mean? JP the second? Or is that John Paul? Oh, is it Jordan Peterson or John Paul? Maybe it's John Paul. Okay. Man can't live without love. He remains incomprehensible to himself. Life is senseless. I happen to agree with that. Pope John Paul. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we're going to wrap this up. I just thought that was kind of interesting. One last thing I'll say is that when I shared some of these stats online, a couple people were saying, I'm kind of surprised by this actually, because anecdotally in my personal life, it seems like a lot of people are searching for God now and finding God now. And that's been my experience too. So I'm curious to see if those predictions we saw at the beginning of this episode, where they're predicting that, less than 30% of the population will be Christian by the year 2070, stuff like that. I'm curious to see if that's going to hold true, because just anecdotally, and again, this might be biased because of the circles I run in now or something, but I know a lot of people searching for God. I know a lot of people who found God, who never thought they would become a believer. I know I have friends who are atheists who don't believe, but have told me they wish they did. They have a longing for a faith in God or a belief in a higher power or a creator. So I think things are shifting. I think actually we might be at the beginning of a revival. And I think there's a lot of the wheat being separated from the chaff. And so that could also be reflected in these studies. That could also be reflected in the data there, because there's a lot of what would you call them? The kind of believers who just go with, like, they're in Christianity because it is what's popular culturally, and then when it's not, they move to something else. I don't view those people as being very sincere in their beliefs. I don't think they've thought a lot about it. I think they just go with the flow. And so I think you could be seeing a lot of those people are now self-reporting they don't believe in anything, but at the same time, I suspect there's a lot of people who are coming to a belief in God through after a lifetime of going through the school of hard knocks. That's just what I suspect. So we'll see. Oh, Jules says, I hear the same as you, Keri, and I think it's the circles we mix in. But my friend who is a pastor said people are leaving in droves and deconstructing. So who knows? Wow. Yeah, I don't know. Therese says, look how well The Chosen and Jesus Revolution movie have done. People are shifting. I don't know. I kind of think so. Maybe. Okay. Thank you guys for hanging out. I hope you have a great week. Wednesday night, live pop culture at 8:00 Central Time with Mystery Chris, me and Mystery Chris. Thursday, there will be a deprogrammed interview. I'm very excited about it. And then Friday, our Kerfefe break will be at the regular time at noon Central. And I hope to see you guys there. Yeah, you have fun today too, Therese. I am off to the Alamo with my family. We're going to go to the basement. That's an old Pee Wee Herman joke. It's just to test and see how old you are in the chat. Thank you guys. Talk to you later. Where is it? I gotta go now. I gotta go.
Oh, I'm gonna go then! And I don't need any of this! I don't need